The air inside my parents' modest home in San Diego carried the faint smell of old coffee and polished wood. I had been there for less than 10 minutes, and already the tension was thick enough to choke me. My duffel bag sat by the door, the same one I'd carried on deployments, filled with uniforms, boots, and the few civilian clothes I actually owned. But today, it wasn't ready for a mission. Today, it was a symbol, a quiet admission that once again, I was being cast out. My father, Thomas Harper, loomed at the center of the living room like a storm front rolling in from the Pacific. He had been a Navy chief petty officer once, the kind of man who barked orders that rattled bulkheads and expected instant obedience. Time had not softened him. Even in retirement, his voice carried the authority of a man convinced he still ran the fleet. He jabbed his finger at me, his hand trembling not with age but with fury. "I served 22 years in the United States Navy," he thundered, his voice echoing off the family photos on the wall. "I know what it takes to be a sailor. I know what it means to earn your place. And you, Lauren," he spat my name as if it were an insult, "you will never understand that. You hide behind classrooms, training courses, and offices. You wash out of every real billet and then dare to call that a career." From the worn armchair across the room, my younger brother, Dylan, smirked. The golden child. The family's shining star. He was dressed in crisp khakis, the bars of a junior officer gleaming on his collar. Dylan didn't even need to speak. The smug tilt of his mouth said everything. He was the chosen one. I was the afterthought. "Look at your brother," my father continued, his voice now a weapon. "Serving on a destroyer. Doing the real work. He's everything a Harper should be. And you? You're nothing but a disgrace to this family's name." The words landed with the weight of cannon fire. It wasn't the first time I had heard them. It wouldn't be the last. My childhood had been a steady drumbeat of comparisons. Dylan's trophies lined the shelves, while my academic medals were shoved into a drawer. Dylan's C grades were shrugged off as a boys will be boys. My A's were dismissed with a perfunctory nod. And now, as adults, the pattern had calcified into something unbreakable. Dylan was the hero. I was the disappointment. He stepped closer, so close I could smell the faint trace of whiskey on his breath, mingling with the sharpness of his aftershave. His jaw clenched as he whispered, low and furious, "You are a failure, Lauren. A failure to the Navy. A failure to this family. You will never be one of us." He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to argue. He wanted proof that his words had broken me, that he still had power over me. But I had learned long ago in the unforgiving silence of the Combat Information Center that composure was survival. My face was calm, my voice steady. "Roger that, sir," I said, using the same crisp acknowledgement I would give a nonsensical order aboard a warship. For a fraction of a second, confusion flickered across his face. He had expected tears, anger, anything but discipline. But I didn't wait for his reply. I bent down, lifted my duffel, and walked out the front door without a backward glance. Behind me, I could almost hear the silence breaking him more than any argument could. Outside, the California air was sharp, tinged with salt from the ocean. My car sat at the curb, the same old Honda I'd been driving since officer candidate school. I loaded my bag into the trunk, slid behind the wheel, and sat for a moment with my hands gripping the steering wheel. My father thought I had surrendered. That a Roger that he was the whimper of someone beaten. He didn't realize it was the steel of a senior officer acknowledging nonsense before returning to duty. He thought he had destroyed me. He had no idea he had just fueled me. Because the truth was simple, he didn't know the Navy I lived in. He remembered the Navy of his past: sweat, salt, deck plates, and orders barked until your throat bled. But he didn't understand the Navy I commanded. A navy of satellites, radars, missile systems, and split-second decisions that meant the difference between survival and annihilation. In his house, I was their failure. On my ship, I was the woman who carried 300 lives on her shoulders. But for him, for Dylan, for my family, none of that mattered. They had made their judgment long ago. And so, I drove away from the house that had never been my home, toward the base that was. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't call anyone to vent. Instead, I let the silence fill me like armor. Because deep down, I knew something they didn't. Tomorrow, on the quarterdeck of a US Navy destroyer, they would see the truth. And the truth would break them. The night after my father cast me out, I checked into a nondescript hotel near Naval Station Norfolk. The place was bland, beige walls, humming air conditioner, the faint scent of detergent that never quite masked years of cigarette smoke. It was the kind of room where no one would remember your face or your name. And that suited me just fine. I laid my duffel bag on the bed and unzipped it with the same precision I used when setting up for deployment. Out came my service dress whites, carefully pressed, the gold oak leaf of a lieutenant commander gleaming under the weak yellow lamp. I set them on the desk chair like sacred armor, polished my shoes until the leather reflected my face, and smoothed out the creases with hands steadier than I felt. There was no storm of tears, no restless pacing. Just a profound calm. Because while my father thought he had cut me down, what he really did was hand me the final piece of fuel I needed. I was about to step into a world where his judgments had no power. In my father's world, I was a ghost at the table. At every dinner, he recited Dylan's achievements as though they were scripture. Dylan had survived his first underway deployment. That was proof of strength. Dylan had been praised by his department head for managing a maintenance schedule. That was evidence of leadership. My accomplishments, by comparison, were never recognized. Once, at a steakhouse in Chicago, we had gathered to celebrate Dylan's promotion to lieutenant junior grade. My father raised a glass of bourbon and delivered a booming speech about the Harper family's and naval legacy, his voice carrying across the room until other diners glanced our way. Dylan grinned through it all, soaking up the spotlight as if it were his birthright. And Lauren's been busy, too, and my father added, an afterthought, his tone syrupy with false warmth. Still taking more classes, I think. I had just completed one of the Navy's most grueling advanced courses, Integrated Air and Missile Defense, a program so selective it had nearly broken me. I mentioned it quietly, but before I could explain further, he scoffed. More schools, he chuckled. In my day, you learned on the deck plates, not in a classroom. Laughter rippled across the table. Dylan leaned in with that cocky grin and offered a new nickname. Staff Sergeant Lauren, he said, deliberately assigning me the wrong rank, even the wrong service branch. A jab designed to erase who I was. My father joined in, shaking his head. Professor. That's what you are. The family professor. The words stung, not because they were clever, but because they carried the weight of years. Years of seeing Dylan's football trophies displayed proudly on the mantel while my academic medals were tucked into a box. Years of hearing, We can't afford your science camp, only to watch a brand new car roll into the driveway for Dylan a month later. And my mother, sweet, fragile Carol, would always smooth it over with a gentle pat on my hand. You know how your father is, as she'd whisper, as if that excused everything. He's just proud of you both in his own way. But that a pride and never looked like pride to me. It looked like dismissal. Yet in the other life I lived, the one far from family dinners and cutting nicknames, everything was different. In the dark, humming world of a combat information center, hundreds of miles from shore, I wasn't the professor. I was the tactical action officer. And when alarms blared, when chaos unfolded across radar screens, my voice was the one that cut through. I remembered one exercise vividly. The room was bathed in blue-green light, faces tense, eyes locked on glowing consoles. Then came the words that froze everyone's blood. Vampire, vampire, vampire. Multiple inbound supersonic missiles bearing 090. It was a simulation, but it felt real. The ship's billion-dollar systems and the lives of 300 sailors rested squarely on my shoulders. There was no room for hesitation. Engage with SM2, I ordered, my voice ice calm. Illuminate with forward director. Spin up CIWS. I want a firing solution now. The crew moved in perfect synchrony, every sailor trained, every command executed. Within seconds, the simulated threats were destroyed. Silence filled the CIC, followed by the captain's gravelly voice over the circuit. Damn fine work, Commander. 2 words. Simple. But in that moment, those 2 words weighed more than every cheer Dylan ever earned from my father. Because in the world that mattered, respect wasn't handed out at the dinner table. It was earned in darkness, under pressure, where mistakes meant lives. I lived in that duality. In one world, I was invisible, an embarrassment to the Harper name. In the other, I was indispensable, a trusted officer in command of lethal power. And as I lay in that hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, I finally understood something important. I didn't need to argue with my father. I didn't need to demand his respect. The Navy had already given me something he never could: proof. Proof that my way of serving, the way he mocked, was not weakness but strength. Tomorrow, when I walked up that pier, when the bell rang out to announce my arrival, both my father and Dylan would see the truth. And the truth would change everything. There are moments that etch themselves into memory so deeply you can almost taste them years later. For me, one of those moments was a family dinner in Chicago, a steakhouse with dark mahogany paneling, brass light fixtures, and the smell of charred ribeye heavy in the air. We were there to celebrate Dylan's promotion, the golden child's next step up the Navy ladder. The night began with fanfare. My father, Tom Harper, stood tall, bourbon glass in hand, his voice booming over the din of the restaurant. A toast, he declared, his cheeks already flushed with drink. To the Harper legacy. To my son, Lieutenant Junior Grade Dylan Harper, carrying forward the tradition of service with honor. The entire table erupted in cheers, cousins clinking glasses, aunts dabbing at tears. Dylan grinned broadly, basking in the applause like a young king coronated before his court. Then my father, with all the pomp of an afterthought, gestured vaguely toward me. And of course, Lauren has been keeping herself busy too, he said, his tone so falsely warm it burned. Still doing more classes, I think. I swallowed my irritation and answered quietly. I just completed the advanced course on integrated air and missile defense. It's one of the Navy's most selective programs. For a brief second, silence touched the table. Then my father chuckled, shaking his head. More school. Always more school. In my day, we learned by sweating it out on deck, not hiding in classrooms. The laughter spread like wildfire. Dylan leaned across the table, that cocky grin plastered on his face. Staff Sergeant Lauren, he teased, deliberately misusing a rank from the wrong branch, knowing exactly how much that jab would sting. The name stuck like a burr. My father pounded the table with laughter. That's perfect, Dylan. Our professor here can't tell the difference between real work and reading a manual. The conversation shifted back to Dylan's exploits, but I sat frozen, stirring the melting ice in my glass of tea. Inside me, a quiet ledger was tallying, not with bitterness, but with precision. Every slight, every dismissal, every time my brother's mediocrity was praised while my achievements were erased. I thought of the science camp in high school I'd begged to attend, only to be told it was too expensive. A month later, Dylan was handed the keys to a shiny new car for his birthday. I thought of the time my academic decathlon trophy was shoved into a closet, while Dylan's junior varsity football plaque was hung proudly above the fireplace. And across the table, my mother, Carol, reached for my hand with a gentle pat. "You know how your father gets," as she whispered, as though that explained everything. "He's just proud of you both, in his own way." But what way was that? When did silence become pride? When did belittlement parse as love? I smiled faintly, the polite mask I had perfected. But inside, the ledger grew heavier. That night after dinner, I returned to my apartment near the base and slipped into silence. No tears, no angry calls to friends. Just quiet. Because I knew the truth. At that very moment, my brother, the family hero, was serving as a junior officer, still learning the basics of division management. Meanwhile, I had already carried the weight of entire combat scenarios on my shoulders, scenarios that could have determined whether a destroyer and its crew survived an enemy assault. But to my family, none of that mattered. Their navy was the one my father remembered: sweat, salt, and shouting. My navy was satellites, missile defense systems, and decisions made in fractions of seconds under the cold glow of radar screens. The irony was sharp. My father dismissed me as a failure for being too academic, too soft. Yet the very schooling he mocked had trained me to command in situations he could never imagine. I remember one fleet exercise in particular. The Combat Information Center was dark except for the glow of consoles, humming with tension. Suddenly the synthesized alarm blared, sharp and jarring. "Vampire! Vampire! Multiple inbound!" The operator's voice was tight but steady. Dozens of simulated enemy missiles streaked across our radar screens. For 30 seconds, 300 lives were mine to protect. My training surged forward. My voice sliced through the tension, calm, firm, decisive. Engage with SM-2. Spin up CIWS. Illuminate with forward director. Firing solution now. Every sailor moved in precise unison. Consoles flickered, systems roared to life. In moments, the missiles were destroyed, reduced to harmless fragments. Silence followed, a silence heavier than any explosion. Then, through the command circuit, my captain's gravelly voice. "Damn fine work, Commander." That was it. 2 words. But those words carried the weight of trust, of recognition, of respect. Respect my father had never given me. I lived split between those 2 worlds. At home, I was the failure. At sea, I was the officer whose calm voice saved lives. The whiplash was exhausting, but it forged something in me. Steel. Resolve. So when my father hurled his final insult and threw me out of his house, I didn't crumble. I didn't need his approval anymore. Because in the only world that mattered, I had already earned it. And soon, very soon, he would see that truth with his own eyes. The Combat Information Center, CIC, was my kingdom. If the bridge was the ship's face, CIC was its brain, dark, humming, lit only by the eerie glow of consoles and radar screens. There were no windows, no sunlight, no distractions. Only data, decisions, and the quiet hum of lives depending on me. I remembered one exercise as if it had happened yesterday. The air was thick with tension, sailors hunched over glowing displays, voices clipped, professional, reporting contacts in precise, steady tones. Then the alarm cut through the room like a blade. Vampire, vampire, vampire. Multiple inbound supersonic sea skimmers, bearing 090. The operator's voice didn't shake, but everyone in that room knew what those words meant. Enemy anti-ship missiles. Fast, low, deadly. In real combat, would have less than a minute before impact. For half a heartbeat, the room was frozen. Then all eyes turned toward me. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. My training, the very same education my father mocked, surged forward like muscle memory. My voice came out calm, firm, absolute. Engage with SM2. Forward director. Illuminate. Spin up CIWS. I need a firing solution. Now. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Sailors' fingers flew across keyboards, systems roared to life, consoles glowed brighter as firing sequences locked on. Target illuminated. Missile lock achieved. Solution ready. Fire. The destroyer unleashed its fury. The simulated roar of standard missiles echoed through the room, followed by the mechanical growl of the close-in weapon system spooling up, ready to spit fire if anything broke through. For 30 agonizing seconds, the ship became a living thing, claws out, teeth bared, defying annihilation. Then, silence. Threat neutralized, ear technician reported. The radar screen bloomed with fragments, each representing an enemy missile destroyed before it could touch steel. The room exhaled as one. The silence wasn't relief, it was respect. Everyone knew how close the knife edge had been, and everyone knew who had carried them across it. A moment later, the captain's voice came through the command circuit, low and steady. "Damn fine work, Commander Harper." That was it. 2 words. But in that darkened room, they were worth more than every toast my father had ever raised for Dylan. That's what my family never understood. They thought Navy life was about the show, uniforms, titles, medals polished for display cases. They saw Dylan on the deck of a ship and assumed that was all there was. But real Navy life was moments like these, 30 seconds that decided whether 300 sailors lived or died. It wasn't about who shouted the loudest. It was about who stayed calmest when chaos reigned. And in that world, my world, calm was my weapon. After the exercise, I stood in the corridor outside CIC, the fluorescent lights buzzing above me. My reflection stared back at me from a small stainless steel panel, face pale, hair pulled tight, eyes steady. For a moment, I thought of my father. I imagined telling him about the missiles, the decisions, the fact that my voice alone had saved the ship. I imagined the way he would scoff, the way he would call it just training, the way he would insist it wasn't real unless you could taste the salt spray on your lips. And then, like always, I imagined Dylan smirking beside him, basking in the glow of someone else's dismissal of me. The anger that rose inside me didn't burn hot, it burned cold. Cold enough to sharpen, to cut. That was when I understood I would never win in their world, because their world wasn't real. Their world was stories told at dinner tables, inflated with pride and nostalgia. Mine was the world where stories became orders, and orders became survival. And one day, I promised myself they would see my world. That day was closer than they knew. Because for weeks, Dylan had been boasting to everyone in earshot that he'd secured a coveted spot for Dad on the family day cruise aboard his ship. It was supposed to be Dylan's triumphant moment, parading his father around the deck, showing off the destroyer as if he were already its master. I knew the playbook. Dad would strut the pier, inspecting every line, critiquing every sailor within earshot, puffing up his chest like he still owned the fleet. Dylan would follow, nodding along dutifully, reveling in second-hand glory. It was their stage, their performance, their empire. They didn't know that on that very day, I was scheduled to arrive on the same ship, not as a guest, not as an observer, but as the incoming executive officer. They thought the spotlight belonged to them. They had no idea the stage was already mine. That night, in my hotel room, I made one simple phone call to my new commanding officer, Commander Richard Evans, a man known throughout the fleet for his by-the-book precision. Commander Evans, this is Lieutenant Commander Lauren Harper. Just confirming my arrival time for tomorrow's family day brief. There was no hint of family drama in my tone. No hesitation. Just pure professionalism. His reply was crisp. Affirmative. XO. The crew's looking forward to meeting you. Your reputation precedes you. See you on the quarterdeck at 0800 sharp. I set the phone down slowly. His words echoed in my head. Your reputation precedes you. For the first time in years, I felt the sting of my father's insults fade. Because in the world that mattered, I wasn't a failure. I was already respected. Tomorrow, the truth would arrive on the pier like the sunrise. And there would be no stopping it. Morning at Naval Station Norfolk always carried a unique weight. The smell of diesel fuel clung to the salt air, gulls circled overhead, and the massive grey silhouettes of destroyers loomed like sleeping giants waiting to be awakened. That morning, one of those giants, the USS Roosevelt, was my destination. I arrived early, walking briskly across the wide concrete pier. The destroyer towered above me, its radar arrays pointed skyward like watchful eyes. The deck gleamed in the early light, sailors moving with purpose as they prepared for the day's visitors. And there they were. At the base of the gangway, my father and my brother stood side by side. My father wore his old chief's cap, the brim frayed but still held like a crown. His posture was rigid, his voice booming across the pier as though he still commanded the fleet. See that line? He barked, gesturing toward a sailor adjusting mooring lines. Sloppy. In my day, that would have meant an extra watch standing. Standards. Son. Standards. Dylan nodded along, a dutiful shadow basking in the glow of his father's nostalgia. To anyone walking past, they looked like kings surveying their kingdom, a retired chief and his officer son, keepers of a proud legacy. They didn't see me yet. I slowed my steps, watching them. For years, they had written me out of their story, relegated me to a footnote. But now, I was about to step onto their stage, not as a guest, not as an afterthought, but as the ship's executive officer. The irony was sharp enough to taste. As I walked down the pier, memories surfaced, one after another. Each footstep seemed to summon them like ghosts. The night Dylan C-grade in high school was excused as a boys will be boys, a while my straight A's barely earned a mention. The day my father called my strategic studies degree a waste of time before spending an hour helping Dylan prepare for a routine qualification board. The Thanksgiving when Dylan's promotion was toasted while my advanced course certificate sat unopened in a drawer. Each slight was no longer a wound, it was fuel. I felt the steel settle into my spine, my posture perfect, my stride steady. My uniform gleamed, every crease sharp, the gold oak leaf on my collar polished until it caught the sun. My face betrayed nothing, but inside, a lifetime of dismissal was condensing into a single moment of undeniable presence. 20 yards from the ship, the officer of the deck spotted me. His eyes widened slightly as he registered my rank. His body snapped to attention, and his voice carried across the water with the force of tradition. Executive officer arriving. The ship's bell rang out, its clear tone cutting through the chatter of sailors and visitors. Conversations stopped. Movements froze. And then, as one, every uniformed sailor on the quarterdeck snapped to attention and raised their hands in salute. The world shifted. A moment before, the pier had belonged to my father's booming voice. Now, it revolved around me. Dylan's reaction was instant and instinctive. His body moved before his mind could stop it, his hand shooting up in a crisp salute. For a heartbeat, his face twisted in horror as realization dawned. He was saluting me, his sister, the Raphaelia, the one he had mocked, dismissed, erased. My father froze mid-sentence, his arms still raised from some grand gesture of critique. His jaw slackened, his entire body rigid. The retired chief in him recognized the uniform, the rank, the protocol. The father in him refused to accept the truth. For years, he had painted me as an outsider to the Navy legacy he worshipped. Now, protocol itself had betrayed him. The Navy he revered had elevated me above his own son. At that moment, Commander Richard Evans, the ship's commanding officer, stepped forward down the gangway. His presence was calm, authoritative, unshakable. He extended his hand toward me with a faint smile. "Welcome aboard, XO," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Glad to have you." The title, XO, landed like a cannon blast. It wasn't just recognition. It was truth, undeniable and absolute. I shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir." Ready to get to work. Behind me. I felt Dylan's eyes boring into me, his salute still half-raised, trembling. My father was silent, his face drained of color. The pier that had been their stage was no longer theirs. It belonged to me. And I didn't even glance their way. The quarterdeck swallowed me, the routine of the Navy wrapping around me like armor. Watchstanders resumed their duties, radios crackled, sailors moved with precision. The ship had no room for family drama, no interest in bruised egos. It had its mission, and I had mine. Behind me, my father and brother were left stranded in silence. Two men who had built their pride on dismissing me, now standing small and irrelevant against the steel reality of the Navy. They had wanted a stage. They got a reckoning. And the curtain had only just risen. The ship's bell still echoed in the salt air as I stepped onto the quarterdeck, the steel beneath my shoes ringing faintly with each measured stride. For me, it was routine, the ritual of arrival, the choreography of protocol drilled into every sailor from the day they first set foot on a ship. But for my father and Dylan, it was something else entirely. It was the moment their illusion cracked. Dylan's hand had shot up in salute before his brain could stop it. Military reflex is faster than pride, faster than denial. And now he stood locked in place, hand trembling at his brow, saluting his sister, the sister he had mocked as her professor, the sister he had laughed off as her failure. His eyes were wide, horrified, as if the very fabric of his world had been torn open. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in him. Not fear of me, but fear of what I represented. Authority. Rank. Reality. And my father was stone. His arm, mid-gesture, hung in the air as though frozen by some cruel magician's spell. His face drained of color, his jaw slack. The retired chief who had built his identity on discipline and tradition was now forced to confront the very tradition that betrayed him. Because the truth was carved into the gold oak leaf on my collar. It was in the watchstander salutes, in the commanding officer's firm handshake, in the simple word XO. The truth was undeniable. I outranked his son. I outranked his stories. I outranked his judgment. Commander Evans's voice broke the silence, steady and warm. Glad to finally have you aboard, Harper. I've heard a great deal about your work. The crew's lucky to have you. Every syllable was another nail in the coffin of my father's narrative. He had spent years convincing himself and everyone else that I was weak, unfit, incapable. Now here was the ship's captain himself, openly praising me in front of the man who had called me a disgrace. Thank you, sir, I replied, my tone calm, professional. Ready to assume duties. Evans nodded, motioning me forward, and we walked together deeper into the ship. The voices of sailors rose and fell around us, the controlled chaos of a destroyer preparing for the day. Radios squawked. Orders were acknowledged with crispy "Aye, sir." The rhythm of command flowed like a heartbeat through the steel. Behind us, the world my father had built collapsed silently. No one looked at him anymore. No one cared about the retired chief's critiques or the junior officer's smirk. On this ship, they were just visitors, spectators at best. The show was over. As I walked, I thought of my father's words the night before. You are a failure. A disgrace. Get out. And then I thought of the truth. The Navy had entrusted me with the second highest position on this warship. My voice would direct its movements. My judgment would shape its missions. Sailors would eat, sleep, and work under the command structure that now flowed through me. Failure? No. I was exactly where I belonged. Later that morning, as the family day cruise began, I oversaw the briefings, the safety checks, the logistics that ensured hundreds of civilians could step aboard without chaos. It was my responsibility to keep the ship steady, to balance hospitality with discipline. And the crew looked to me, not to Dylan, not to Evans, to keep the machine running smoothly. I could feel eyes on me as I moved through the passageways. Sailors straightened when I passed, voices snapping sharper, salutes crisper. Word had already spread. The new XO was here, and she wasn't what anyone expected. And somewhere above, on the weather decks, I knew my father was still lingering. Still processing. Still choking on the sight of his daughter commanding the very stage he thought belonged to him and his golden boy. At one point, I crossed paths with Dylan in a narrow passageway. He had been giving a small group of visitors a tour, his big moment, the day he had bragged about for weeks. When he saw me, his words faltered. The visitors looked confused as his face paled, his eyes darting to the oak leaf on my collar, to the sailors who snapped to attention as I walked by. I paused, just long enough to look him in the eye. His mouth opened, but no words came. For once, the ever-confident Dylan had nothing to say. I gave him a curt nod, professional, dismissive. Not as a sister, not as someone who owed him acknowledgement, but as a senior officer giving a junior one the bare courtesy required. Then I turned and walked on, leaving him to stew in silence. His audience no longer cared about his stories. They had seen the truth too. Hours later, when the ship returned to port and the visitors disembarked, my father and Dylan slipped away quietly. No booming voice, no smirking commentary. Just silence. And for the first time, it wasn't me who left that silence behind. It was them. 6 months later, the Atlantic was a steel-grey monster, waves rising like mountains, wind howling as if it wanted to tear the ship apart. The USS Roosevelt fought her way through the storm, rolling and pitching, her bow disappearing into walls of water before slamming down again with bone-rattling force. Every impact sent a shudder through the deck plates, a reminder that even a billion-dollar destroyer was still at the mercy of the sea. But on the bridge, there was calm. Controlled order. I stood at the center, officer of the deck, my feet planted, hands steady on the console rail. My voice cut through the roar of the storm and the constant hum of electronics. Helm, steady course 270. Steady 270. Lee helm, set revolutions for 125 knots. Let's ride it out. 125 knots. Every response came back sharp, immediate, unquestioning. The sailors' eyes flicked to me, not in fear, but in confidence. They trusted me to guide them through. My presence wasn't questioned, my judgment wasn't debated. It was followed, because they knew I had earned it. The bridge shook again as another wave crashed over the bow, water slamming against reinforced glass. A junior helmsman's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel. I placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and firm. Easy, petty officer. Trust the ship. She's built for this. And so are you. He nodded, jaw tight, but his shoulders relaxed. That was leadership, not barking orders like my father had always claimed, but giving strength when fear threatened to take hold. This was my family now. Not the one that mocked me at dinners, not the one that dismissed my achievements, but the crew standing watch with me in the heart of the storm. 300 sailors, bonded not by blood but by duty, trust, and the unspoken promise that none of us stood alone. I thought of my father, sitting at home, probably telling stories of his Navy days over a beer with old friends. He had always claimed that family meant legacy, that Dylan carried the Harper name proudly while I had tarnished it. But standing on that bridge, surrounded by sailors who looked to me for guidance, I knew the truth. Family wasn't about names or bloodlines. Family was about showing up in the darkest hours, about steady hands and calm voices when the storm tried to swallow you whole. And in that sense, I had a bigger family than I ever imagined. Later, When the storm eased slightly, I stepped into my stateroom to review readiness reports. The hum of the ship's engines filled the quiet, steady as a heartbeat. I set my cap on the desk, pulled out a pen, and began signing off on maintenance logs, training schedules, inspection notes. The work was endless, but it grounded me. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. I hesitated before opening it, half expecting another apology on Dad's behalf, another attempt to smooth over what couldn't be smoothed. But when I read the words, I froze. Your father told one of his old friends from the chief's mess that his daughter is the XO of a destroyer. I think he was proud. I stared at the screen. Proud. The word I had chased for years, the currency I had begged for at every dinner table, every family gathering. The word that had been withheld, weaponized, dangled just out of reach. Once, those words would have been everything. Once, they would have broken me open with joy. But now they were hollow. I set the phone down, screen side down on the desk. I didn't reply. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to. Because I had realized something in the heart of that storm, his pride was no longer the measure of my worth. My validation wasn't tied to his approval, wasn't dependent on a reluctant compliment whispered secondhand. It was here. In the trust of my sailors. In the bridge team that followed my voice without hesitation. In the rhythm of the ship beneath my feet, alive and steady in the fury of the ocean. I no longer needed his recognition. I had already built my legacy without it. That night, as I walked the passageways, sailors nodded respectfully, some offering a quiet, evening, XO. Each word carried more meaning than anything my father had ever said. They weren't just acknowledgements of rank. They were acknowledgements of trust. And trust, I realized, was worth more than pride. Much more. The sea still roared outside, endless and unforgiving. But inside, within the steel walls of the Roosevelt, there was peace. Not because the storm had calmed, but because I had. For years, my father had called me a failure. For years, Dylan had mocked me as weak. But in the Navy, in the world that mattered, my name wasn't failure. It was Executive Officer Harper. And that was enough. The storm had passed, leaving the ocean calmer but still restless. Grey swells rolled endlessly toward the horizon, the kind that reminded you of how small a warship really was, no matter how much steel or firepower it carried. On the bridge, sailors were laughing now, relieved, swapping stories about the wildest roll or the highest wave. Their trust in me had been tested and proven. That trust had become a bond no storm could shake. Back in my stateroom, I sat at the small desk under the harsh glow of fluorescent light. Readiness reports and maintenance logs were spread across the surface, but my eyes drifted back to the phone sitting screen side down. My mother's message lingered in my mind like a ghost. Your father told one of his old friends that his daughter is the XO of a destroyer. I think he was proud. Proud. For years, that word had been the prize I chased. Every late night spent studying, every brutal qualification board, every time I stood alone in a world that doubted me, I told myself it would all be worth it when he finally said he was proud. But when the word finally came, second-hand and delayed, it didn't feel like victory. It felt empty. I thought back to my childhood. To the way my father's approval had always been rationed out like a scarce resource, granted only to Dylan, withheld from me no matter what I achieved. I remembered my medals shoved into drawers, my dreams dismissed with a scoff, my quiet achievements drowned out by Dylan's loud, shallow victories. And I realized something that shook me more than the storm had. I didn't need it anymore. Pride was his currency, not mine. Respect, trust, competence, that was mine. And I already had it in abundance, not from him, but from the people who mattered. On the bridge, sailors straightened when I walked in, not because I demanded it, but because they knew I'd earned it. In CIC, my voice cut through chaos, not because of my name, but because of my decisions. Every salute, every every quiet nod of acknowledgement in the passageways, that was pride. Not his, but mine. I picked up the phone again and stared at the message. For a brief moment, I considered replying. Something simple like, "Tell him I know." Or even, "That means a lot." But the words felt foreign in my mouth, like they belonged to another version of me, the one still desperate for his validation. I set the phone down again without typing a response. Because I no longer dealt in his currency. Later that evening, I walked the weather deck. The sea was calmer now, the moonlight carving silver parts across the waves. The air was cold and clean, the kind that cut through every thought and left you raw and honest. I leaned against the rail and let the wind whip through my hair, my uniform jacket pulled tight against the chill. Around me, the ship hummed with life, the low thrum of engines, the clatter of boots on steel, the steady rhythm of a warship that never truly slept. This was my family. These sailors, this ship, this life I had built with my own hands. My father hadn't given it to me. Dylan hadn't shared it with me. I had forged it in the long nights, the grueling drills, the battles fought in silence where failure wasn't an option. And unlike the fragile pride of a man clinging to his past, this family's respect was real. Solid. Unbreakable. For the first time in years, I felt peace. Not the fleeting kind that came with small victories, but the deep, lasting peace of knowing I no longer needed to prove myself to people who had never tried to see me. My father's opinion no longer held me hostage. Dylan's smirk no longer stung. Their voices no longer echoed in my head. All that mattered was the steady pulse of the ship beneath my feet, the trust of the crew that looked to me in storms, and the knowledge that I had built a legacy on my own terms. When I finally returned to my stateroom, I tucked my mother's message into a mental drawer, just like all the times my own achievements had been tucked away before. But this time, I wasn't hiding it. I was discarding it. Because the truth was simple. I didn't need my father to be proud of me. I was proud of myself. And that was more than enough. Spring crept in quietly, the Atlantic softening from steel to slate, the air warmer on the morning checks. The Roosevelt rode easier now, but the cruise pace never slowed. Inspections, drills, repairs, watch rotations. A destroyer is never finished. It simply moves from one degree of ready to the next. That rhythm suited me. It left little space for ghosts. On a Tuesday that smelled faintly of machine oil and rain, we held command climate training in the mess decks. I stood at the front, sleeves rolled, collar open, reading questions off a grease-smudged clipboard while sailors squeezed onto benches with coffee and notebooks. I watched them, veterans with calm eyes, new check-ins still learning the map of the ship by heart, chiefs who communicated whole sentences with a tilt of the chin. They were my measure of time now. Their progress, their confidence, the way their voices steadied when they briefed. That was the calendar I lived by. Afterward, a seaman apprentice waited until the crowd thinned, hovering like he might retreat at any moment. XO, could I ask something? His name tape read Reyes. Brand new, still memorizing valve stations and line diagrams. Walk with me, EI said, and we moved through the narrow passageways, sidestepping a maintenance cart and a tangle of orange extension cords. He kept pace, then blurted it out, and my dad says I should have chosen a real job. He says the Navy is for people who couldn't hack college. He won't come to my ship visit next month. He looked away quickly, embarrassed by how much it hurt. My response surprised us both by how fast it came. He then make the Navy the place where you become the person he can't ignore. Not to win him, I paused as we passed a frame of damage control gear, but to win yourself. He nodded, the set of his shoulders changing. The ship hummed around us, a steel chorus repeating the lesson. You can't control their story, only your watch. We stopped at the ladder well that dropped toward engineering. I tapped the stanchion with 2 knuckles. Reyes, pride from others is weather. It changes. Competence is climate. You build it. And it holds. His salute was crisp. When he vanished down the ladder, I felt the strange, warm echo of recognition. Once, not long ago, I had needed someone to say those words to me. No one had. I learned them instead. That afternoon, the quarterdeck watch passed me a message from the front gate. Visitor for XO. No appointment. No name left. I didn't need one. Some stories still announce themselves before they arrive. I found him near the pier fence, Thomas Harper, hands in the pockets of a jacket I remembered from my childhood, the brim of his old chief's cap shadowing his eyes. He looked smaller outside the stories he told, like a man who had finally set down a duffel he'd carried too far. We stood with chain link between us, the destroyer a grey wall at my back. I was in town, he said, though we both knew people don't end up at a secured naval base by accident. He cleared his throat, no bluster left, only gravel. Heard from an old messmate you took the ship through that nor'easter. Said your crew swears by you. A younger version of me would have chased that sentence with questions, desperate to bottle praise before it evaporated. The woman on the pier only listened. I let the goals fill the space where pleading used to live. I wasn't fair, he tried again. To you. I measured you by a Navy that isn't the Navy anymore. Or maybe I measured you by myself. He waited, bracing for a verdict I didn't owe him. I'm on duty, I said, finally. Not cruel, simply true. The ship sails with or without us, Dad. He flinched, not at the title but at the distance in it. Could we? He gestured vaguely. Coffee, maybe. Sometime. Maybe, I said, and the word meant what it said, not a promise, not a punishment. A boundary you could set your watch to. He nodded like a sailor acknowledging a bell, then turned away. I watched him go until the base swallowed him. No triumph rose in me, no vengeance cooling on the tongue. Just the soft, stable weight of alignment. The ledger I'd kept for so long no longer needed columns. That evening, the sun burned low and copper on the water. The XO's paperwork mountain had been reduced to a range of manageable hills, and I took my coffee topside. Commander Evans joined me, leaning on the rail with that posture of officers who have worn heavy weather and long nights like a second uniform. Crew's in a good place, he said. They put themselves there, I answered. I just keep the rails painted. He smiled at that. Promotion list posts next quarter. He didn't look at me when he said it. Good captains don't hand futures like candy. They plant the idea like a seed and let you decide if you're the ground. I thought of the ladder I'd climbed, the boards and qualls and the long, sleepless hours that never made it into family speeches. I thought of Reyes, squaring his shoulders toward a watch that would shape him more honestly than any dinner table. If it comes, I said, I'll be ready. You always are, he replied, and left me to the fading light. Night watches are their own country. The red glow of the bridge. The rhythm of reports. The quiet conviction that the ship moves because you said the words that made it move. Near midnight, I took a slow walk through the compartments, checking hatches with my palm, listening to the working heartbeat of steel and purpose. A machinist mate looked up from a pump alignment and grinned, grease on her cheek like war paint. Evening. XO. Carry on, I said, and meant I trust you. At 0200, the horizon was a dark seam, the sea-black silk tugging at the hull. I stood just inside the bridge wing, wind needling my face, and let the old story unwind for me like a line cast overboard. The dinners, the nicknames, the car keys given to the wrong kid, the way pride had been dangled like liberty you hadn't earned. The ocean took it, made no comment, offered no applause. Good. Some endings require no audience. People think legacy is a wall of plaques. Sometimes it's simpler. A helmsman's hand steadying because you told him he could, a junior officer making the right call at 0300 because you taught clarity over volume, a ship that moves through storms with less fear because your voice set the tone. That's the architecture I'm building. Steel and habit, trust and repetition, readiness written into muscle memory. Near dawn, a message blinked on my phone. Mom. He said he was proud again. He didn't ask me to tell you this time. I'm telling you because I wanted to, not because he did. I stared at it, felt the old ache stir, then settle. I typed back, we're underway at first light. I'm good. It was the truest thing I could say. Sunrise drew a clean line across the sea. The ship woke fully, boots on deck, coffee breath, the first jokes of the day. I took the XO's chair and signed the plan of the day with a name I no longer feared wasn't enough. Executive Officer L. Harper. We stood the morning brief. Departments reported. Issues were owned and solved. The Roosevelt swung her bow toward work that would never quite be finished, which is another way of saying worth doing. I gave the final nod, the one that says make it so, and the crew flowed into motion. If you've ever been told you don't belong, by a parent, a boss, a chorus of small, confident voices, listen closely. The sea doesn't care about their story. Neither does the watch bill. Write your own in the language of competence and repetition. Let your proof be the orders you give and the steadiness you keep when the alarms sound. Let your legacy be the people who stand taller because you did. The bell rang. The day began. We moved. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the exact weight of my life fit perfectly in my hands. Not a failure. Not a footnote. An officer, standing the watch I chose.